My name is Glories. I'm 30 years old. My life seemed calm and orderly, filled with simple joys and familiar little things. I am married to Bruce, and we recently celebrated our first wedding anniversary. From the very beginning of our relationship, my husband and I made plans for the future, dreaming of a house filled with children's laughter and walks through cozy neighborhoods. However, as often happens, reality turned out to be much more complicated than we had imagined. Bruce was the eldest son in his family, and his parents lived just a few blocks from our apartment. This close proximity had its advantages, but more often than not, it led to them showing up at our door unannounced. Sometimes they came under the pretext of simply going for a walk, sometimes bringing homemade food, but more often they would just appear on our doorstep to visit. Moreover, Bruce's sister, Julia, lived nearby with her family and frequently dropped by as well. These visits rarely ended quickly. Family conversations stretched for hours, and I increasingly found myself thinking that our home was turning into a branch of their family nest. Despite all the discomforts, I tried not to complain. Bruce was close to his family, and I respected that. Nevertheless, our personal space was becoming more and more limited, and the dreams of quiet evenings together seemed to be fading into the background. Our apartment, small but cozy, with windows overlooking a park, was my personal sanctuary. The view from there was beautiful, especially at sunset, when the sky turned orange and pink. But this tranquility was shattered one evening when, while we were having dinner, my mother-in-law, glancing out the window, dreamily said, "I would love to live here. In a place like this." My father-in-law, sitting next to her, nodded thoughtfully and added, "It really is very nice here. There's even a free room." Bruce smiled and, as it seemed to me, picked up on this idea a bit too quickly. "That would be great. We could save on rent, and you, Mom and Dad, wouldn't have to walk far." He spoke with such enthusiasm, as if this apartment really belonged to him. I felt a strange mix of surprise and indignation. After all, the apartment wasn't ours. It still belonged to my brother Perry, who had allowed Bruce and me to live here after our wedding. However, judging by my husband's expression, he was completely sure that by marrying me, this apartment automatically became our shared property. This confusion had started even before the wedding. When Bruce met my family, he and his parents were surprised to learn that our parents had both passed away long ago. My father died 2 years ago, leaving Perry and me a solid foundation for an independent life. He worked for a large corporation, providing for all of us. My mother, a housewife who was the heart of our family, passed away a year earlier. They both did everything they could to prepare us for adult life, and thanks to their efforts, Perry and I were managing well. However, when Bruce and I first visited our old family home, his parents' reaction was far from warm. The house, which I held dear as a childhood memory, seemed too modest for them. My mother-in-law made a cutting remark. "The house is a bit old. You must have had some financial difficulties." Perry, always calm and composed, smiled and responded, "Not at all. We've been doing just fine. But thank you for your concern." Despite his tactfulness, I could see the condescending look in my mother-in-law's eyes. Perhaps the old facade of the house gave her the false impression that we were living poorly. But Perry, who owned a significant portion of real estate, provided for both of us. His rental income gave him the financial freedom that my mother-in-law clearly underestimated. "What do you do for a living?" my father-in-law once asked Perry. "I work for myself," my brother answered calmly. "The income from real estate allows me to be independent of employers." His confident tone seemed to slightly unsettle my father-in-law, but only for a moment. He soon returned to the topic of our apartment, musing about how convenient it would be for all of us to live together. Now, looking at Bruce, who was beaming, I couldn't understand how seriously he took this idea. To me, our apartment wasn't just a place where we lived. It symbolized my independence, the freedom I had managed to preserve despite numerous challenges. The thought that this freedom might be jeopardized filled me with anxiety. The apartment where we live was at the heart of this entire story. It fully belonged to my brother Perry, and I had known this from the very beginning. However, even before our wedding, I was able to live here without paying rent thanks to my brother's generosity. This was our unspoken family agreement, one that didn't require explanations or justifications. But apparently, my new family, the family of my husband, saw things differently. My mother-in-law, a woman with refined manners and a sharp tongue, never missed an opportunity to make a comment that only emphasized her arrogance. That day, looking at the simple but cozy setting of our home, she sarcastically remarked, "I don't think working for yourself always brings in good money if you have to live in such an old house." Her words were so full of contempt that even I felt a slight embarrassment. However, my sister-in-law, Perry's wife, Carolyn, usually kind and delicate, couldn't help but give a slight smile. "Yes, the house is old, but it's spacious. Although, cleaning here is a real battle," she responded with a touch of sarcasm, which my mother-in-law, of course, didn't catch. I watched as Carolyn, usually so composed, momentarily lost her restraint due to her mother-in-law's blatant rudeness. Her eyes, normally calm and kind, flashed with irritation, but she quickly regained her composure, skillfully softening the atmosphere. As always, Perry came to the rescue, changing the subject. His ability to ease tension was remarkable. He remarked that my husband and his parents, while discussing the future, had automatically assumed that we would continue living here, then added with a hint of irony, "So, you two are going to stay in this apartment after the wedding?" Bruce nodded enthusiastically, as if this decision had already been made long ago. However, I noticed that my father-in-law was preparing to make some sharp remark. His words, spoken a little later, were a sudden blow to me. "How can Glories, who apparently doesn't have any money, live in such an apartment?" he sneered. I felt as though I were under a microscope, under the scrutinizing gaze of the entire family. But thankfully, Perry intervened. His quiet, yet confident laugh broke the heavy silence. "This apartment was bought with the inheritance our father left us. Everything's fair," he said with a hint of pride. Bruce and his parents looked a little stunned. But when Carolyn added, "Glory's bought this apartment. She just doesn't like talking about it," the situation took an even more absurd turn. I froze. It was a lie, but at the same time, it was a defense. Perry nodded calmly, confirming Carolyn's words. He clearly took pride in the fabricated story that his sister had bought the apartment herself, even though both of us knew the truth: the property belonged to him. Suddenly, my mother-in-law's attitude changed. Her cutting remarks turned into a much friendlier tone. She looked at me with a new appraisal, although her gaze still wasn't free from bias. After that evening, when they left, I finally asked my brother the question that had been bothering me. "Why did you lie? Why did you say this apartment is mine?" Perry, with his usual smile, answered calmly, "Because they underestimated you, Glories. I just played a little joke." "But didn't you notice how their attitude changed?" His words sounded both logical and strange. Indeed, my mother-in-law and father-in-law had suddenly become much warmer towards me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this fabrication had become too complicated to maintain. However, Perry insisted that I not tell anyone the truth. Noticing my confusion, Carolyn came up to me later when Perry had left the room. "Be careful with Bruce's parents. They can be stubborn, but if it gets difficult, you can always come here and talk." Her words were sincere, and I felt relieved. Carolyn's care always soothed me, as did her confidence that everything could be resolved. She was like a true sister to me, a support I could rely on. In the days that followed, I tried not to give too much importance to this new myth about the apartment. However, observing how drastically my husband's family's attitude had changed, I couldn't help but think about how much their opinion depended on the false belief about my situation. It was shocking to realize how carelessly my relatives regarded my brother, especially when the conversation turned to his apartment. My mother-in-law's sly remarks about the old house stayed in my mind like a small but painful wound. But, as I thought at the time, it wasn't a problem because we didn't live together. We had our own cozy corner, and I was happy in my marriage with Bruce. My brother's house was nearby, and it was quite convenient to host everyone during the holidays. It seemed that my life was settling down. This was how my new life began, with new dreams and hopes, with our small house that was meant to be the foundation for the future. I tried to forget that incident, although, to be honest, its sting continued to slip into my thoughts now and then. But life doesn't stop, and I decided that I needed to move forward. No matter how hard I tried, something from the past wouldn't let go. And then, unexpectedly, one warm winter day, when the snow was just beginning to cover the ground with a thin layer, a guest appeared, someone I hadn't expected at all. I had decided to visit my brother, and, as usual, I was getting ready to go to him, but to my surprise, at the door of our apartment appeared not only Bruce but also his parents, my mother-in-law and father-in-law. Their visit was unexpected and quite strange. I had been expecting us to go to their place for Christmas, not to host the holiday in our home. My thoughts immediately became tangled, and standing in the hallway, I involuntarily asked, "What are you doing here? We were supposed to meet at your place?" My mother-in-law smirked, as if justifying their unexpected appearance, and said, "It's warm here, and the view is beautiful, so we decided to just drop by. Don't worry, Glories, it's not a problem." There was something indefinite in her expression, as if they felt entitled to interfere in our little world, while I, on the other hand, just wanted to spend the evening in peace and privacy. I felt a slight unease in my soul, but I didn't show it. I stood in indecision for a few minutes until the thought formed in my mind that I needed to act, no matter how unpleasant it was. I sighed and smiled, saying, "All right, then let me make you some coffee and serve some snacks." In reality, in moments like this, when every visit from my husband's family seemed inevitable, and my mother-in-law's failed comments about the spacious old house still lingered in my memory, I felt my inner freedom slipping away. Cleaning, preparing for holidays, endless efforts to maintain harmony in the house, when every little thing could turn into a topic for discussion, it was all starting to wear me out. But I continued to smile, because my duty was to remain polite and a gracious hostess. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law took on the role of a dictatorial hostess, adding, "Glories, I prefer roast turkey, not these usual Christmas dishes. You know how I love tradition." At that moment, it seemed as if everything I had ever known about the simple joys of Christmas had disappeared. My mother-in-law's words sounded like a reminder of how little I knew, how little I controlled my life. Even in this festive moment, when I was trying to feel the coziness and calm, everything seemed to revolve around her demands. It was exhausting, but I couldn't refuse what had to be done according to her rules. I smiled and rushed to the kitchen to prepare everything she had asked for. Inside, everything was bubbling, but on the outside, I kept my composure. I knew that it would be easier this way than to fight them. After all, if I continued to yield, they might eventually leave, and I would be able to reclaim my space. I told Bruce that it was really troublesome when his parents suddenly decided to stay the night. It disrupted my usual routine, where I felt some semblance of stability. Our life together was supposed to be cozy, with clear boundaries and respect for personal space. But now everything seemed different, as we couldn't even spend a quiet evening alone. "You knew about this in advance, didn't you see that I was upset?" I asked, trying to convey the weight of what had happened in my voice. Bruce, as always, looked calm and slightly confused, as if he didn't even realize what was going on. His face showed nothing but the usual bewilderment, and that frustrated me even more. "What's wrong?" he simply asked, as if everything was fine, as though nothing had changed. How could this not be obvious? How could he not understand that I was bothered by all this chaos, when his family barged into our space without warning, took over our place, and acted like it was their home? But, as always, he continued to stick to his line. "They said they'll come again, they're always welcome here," he added, as if that could somehow soften the situation. No, I was completely stunned by my husband's reaction. I couldn't understand how he could be so indifferent to what was happening around him. His parents were having fun, doing whatever they wanted, and leaving without ever considering how I felt. I genuinely worried that they might one day just take over our house. After all, they clearly didn't see any boundaries, didn't consider our wishes, and didn't regard me as the mistress of this place. I couldn't hide my worries anymore, and as always, I turned to my brother for advice. My brother Perry and his wife Carolyn were among the few who always tried to understand me. I told them how I felt, about how difficult it had become because of Bruce's family interfering in our life. Carolyn was furious when I told her. She literally exclaimed, "This is awful, you need to talk to Bruce and explain the situation. He can't keep acting like this." I understood that her words were sincere and aimed at helping. But despite her support, I didn't see any change in my husband's behavior. In his eyes, I no longer saw the person I had chosen to spend my life with. It was as though he was under the complete control of his parents, and that made me feel helpless. Recently, Bruce had been coming home late, as though he didn't want to spend time with me. More and more hours were spent outside the house, and every evening I was left alone, waiting for the moment we might finally talk. But no conversation could happen because he was busy with his family matters. My brother and Carolyn were just perplexed by my stories. Perry, always sincere and attentive, couldn't believe how bad things had gotten. He asked me questions, trying to find a way out of the situation, but what could I tell him? I didn't know what to do. Despite all of this, my relatives couldn't understand the depth of my pain. They didn't see how I was tormented by the feeling that the house, which was supposed to be ours, was slowly turning into a place where anyone could feel at home, when my boundaries no longer mattered. In their eyes, everything seemed fine. We were all one family, and that was how it should be. But it was hard for me. I couldn't understand why they couldn't see what was happening. Meanwhile, each day became a trial. Against the backdrop of all these events, I felt increasingly alone. I apologized on the phone, and while my brother laughed, I felt a strange mix of laughter and doubt in his voice, which I couldn't fully understand. He was surprisingly restrained, although I knew that, no matter how hard he tried to hide it, his words were full of concern. "Yeah, they're weird, Glories," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "Maybe you should reconsider your future with Bruce." His words echoed in my head, and I felt a cold heaviness of worry settle in my chest. Something in those words resonated with my own concerns. They seemed to echo my inner doubts, which I couldn't shake off, despite all my efforts. As I was about to hang up, my brother's wife, always wise and cautious, added something that made me flinch. "Glories, I don't know how you put up with it. Bruce is always coming home late. Maybe he's up to something." Her words hit me like lightning, straight to the heart. They were unexpected but so plausible that they made me question my own feelings even more. Maybe she was right. I'd always felt that something wasn't right, that his strange late returns home weren't random. His smiles, his explanations, his empty promises, everything was beginning to seem fake, and his attention to his family seemed like a cover for something darker. My worry deepened when I thought that maybe my brother's wife wasn't exaggerating. I shared my suspicions about his infidelity, and my brother's voice changed sharply. He became unusually stern, which made me even more uneasy. "If he's cheating while you're taking care of the family, that's unacceptable," Perry raised his voice, and I felt something significant in his words. He wasn't willing to ignore these suspicions. "I'll take care of it." Those words slightly eased my heart. Though I wasn't sure they would solve anything, the mere thought that someone besides me had started to notice Bruce's strange behavior gave me a small glimmer of hope. My brother promised to help, and that meant more to me than I could admit out loud. There was something in his words that made me believe in fairness, that at least someone from my family would be there to support me. When I hung up the phone, I felt a bitter relief. For a moment, I regained a sense of control, but I was still in the dark about what was really happening in Bruce's life. He remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him. Every evening, coming home late, he had no idea what I was thinking about his outings, his secrecy. He was late again and again, always claiming he'd been held up at work, but I no longer believed him. In some way, I was beginning to feel that his late returns weren't just accidents. My father-in-law's visits were becoming more frequent, and their presence continued to disrupt our space, leaving me no time to think. I was starting to feel like all of this was part of a bigger game, where I was just a pawn. Bruce could at least try to be honest with me, but he kept hiding everything, deepening the gap between us. Inside, I increasingly felt that his family, his relatives, were perhaps the ones who controlled him, and I was just a trivial part of his life, no different from anyone else. I silently watched my sister-in-law, who seemed delighted with what was happening. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and her lips curled into a smirk. She could hardly hide her satisfaction with this strange arrangement that we had all unwillingly dragged into our lives. Seeing my calm, almost emotionless behavior, she seemed to sense that the atmosphere was somewhat tense, but couldn't quite grasp what exactly I didn't like. I, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of not just disappointment, but a kind of dull anger inside me. At that moment, my mother, who had been nearby and seemed to sense the change in the air, approached me with a note of irritation. "Why are you so calm?" Her voice was full of confusion, and her gaze was searching for an answer, as if she expected me to explain why I'd agreed to such behavior from his family. "Even Bruce kept this a secret from you. How can you just sit here and not react?" I couldn't answer her because I didn't even know what to think myself. My silence wasn't so much calmness as it was a kind of self-protective barrier. I couldn't even bring myself to admit how disappointed I was in my husband, and at the same time, I couldn't justify his behavior. This feeling seemed to press on me from both sides. On one hand, I felt hurt, and on the other, fury at how Bruce had stopped valuing me and my feelings. Didn't he know that at least some control over our shared space was important to me? My disappointment in my husband deepened when I learned that he had decided to move his parents in without any agreement from me. I couldn't forgive him for that. Why did he have so little respect for my boundaries, my preferences? It wasn't just unpleasant, it was painful. But that day, Bruce wasn't home, and my thoughts remained unspoken. I couldn't talk to him, and that only deepened my inner anxiety. I was left alone in this endless silence, which was beginning to wear me down more and more. And then, just when I thought things couldn't possibly get worse, my father-in-law appeared. He entered with the same air of confidence in his own righteousness and authority as always. But this time, his words struck me like a lightning bolt. "We'll give you $200,000 in alimony," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "So please, divorce our son and leave this apartment." My heart skipped a few beats. I felt everything inside me tighten, and then a furious outrage flared up. How could they talk about divorce as if it were nothing serious, just a transaction? How could they think that money would solve everything? Bruce, of course, wasn't to blame, but his family seemed to believe they had the right to control not only the apartment but also my feelings. It was so humiliating. I never imagined I would reach the point of facing such cynicism. My father-in-law continued, as if nothing had happened. "We think it's fair. You get this apartment, so you need to compensate for everything." His certainty infuriated me, as if they were merely dealing with a property issue, not the fate of an entire family. His words were as cold as ice, devoid of any empathy. He didn't even stop to consider how his proposal was destroying everything I had tried to build. But what was even more absurd was how they kept acting as if I were not a person, but just an object that could be moved or replaced. Their complete lack of understanding of the situation was so glaring that I couldn't help but feel a strange bewilderment. And at that moment, when their words continued to echo in my ears, I couldn't contain myself. All I wanted to do was laugh. It was so ridiculous that, if it weren't for my intense inner irritation, I would have burst out laughing. "Wow, this is incredible," I said quietly, unable to hide my astonishment. It was like watching a drama, trying to hold back laughter. Everything happening seemed so absurd that reality no longer mattered. It was total chaos, and despite all my frustration, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too ridiculous to be true. "Bruce, you really betrayed me." Those words escaped from me with such force that I barely managed to hold back the tremor in my voice. I was shaken by his silence, his complete indifference to what was happening. I couldn't believe that he didn't find a single word of justification, not even a glance to show that he understood what he had done. His silence spoke louder than any words. It seemed like an admission that he knew his guilt but wasn't ready to take responsibility. My father-in-law, unlike Bruce, didn't hide his dissatisfaction. He kept asking the questions that Bruce wasn't answering. This only deepened my frustration and unease. And then, when the silence became too unbearable, my sister-in-law, seemingly sensing that something was brewing, mumbled something under her breath. "This is how marriages end. The person who's cheated on is also to blame." They ignored all their wife's words. I felt something cold grip my heart. There was something in her words that echoed what I had often thought myself but couldn't admit aloud. Was I to blame? Maybe I had missed something I hadn't noticed, that led to this moment. But I quickly pushed that thought away. It no longer mattered. I gathered all my willpower and turned to my father-in-law, resolutely. "Please, continue with the paperwork for the apartment, regardless of what Bruce did. He is to blame, but that no longer matters. The decision has been made." I didn't know what I would feel when that moment came, but I knew I had to move forward. This was the final step, the last act of acceptance, the final stroke of a new life that was starting here, from this moment. My words were firmer than ever before. My father-in-law nodded, and his face became more determined. He said he would start signing the documents right away, and his manner made it clear that he was eager to finish everything as quickly as possible. The compensation was paid, the money was already in my account, and this fact seemed to be both a relief and yet another loss. I watched as my father-in-law signed the papers with some inner satisfaction, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite his restraint, he wasn't just an observer in this situation but seemed to be the one directing it. He was eager to wrap everything up quickly, almost with impatience, as if he wanted to close this chapter once and for all. Bruce stood nearby, silent, avoiding our gaze. It was as though he was trying to disappear into the space, vanish from my world. I noticed how he avoided eye contact, how his gaze darted around, and his lips were pressed tightly together, as if he was trying to suppress any feelings within himself. His silence was painful and unsettling. When the signing was completed, my father-in-law said, "From now on, this is our house. You have no further claim to it, so please leave as soon as possible, glories." Those words sounded like a verdict. As if everything had been decided once and for all, as if there were no chance of returning. Everything I had known, everything I had once called mine, was now. I was in a daze, feeling neither relief, nor regret, nor anger. I simply left, without saying a word, feeling the heavy silence pressing down on me. We left the apartment. Bruce's gaze was hidden, and he remained silent. I couldn't understand what was happening with him, and honestly, I didn't want to know anymore. All I could do was walk out of that house, which was no longer mine. When I answered calmly, my mother-in-law began speaking hesitantly. Her words were fragmented and unsure, as if she didn't quite realize what she was about to say. "We were planning to use the apartment as collateral for ourselves, but now we can't get back the $200,000. Her admission was so unexpected that I was momentarily speechless. It was a shock. I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was joking, but her eyes didn't blink, and her gaze was filled with genuine concern. Those words made me feel as though everything that had happened so far was just the beginning of a much more complicated and tangled game. Her confession was shocking not only to me but also to my ex-husband and his relatives. We all stood there, shoulders slumped, unsure how to react. The atmosphere became heavier, as though some unseen but inevitable weight was hanging over us. The silence was broken by a restless thought of mine. I quickly scanned the room and noticed that the sister-in-law who usually stayed with them was absent. This strange absence caught my attention. I instantly asked, "Where's your sister? Why isn't she here?" My ex-husband answered awkwardly, his voice measured, as if he was trying to find the right words. "Looks like she was cheating too. That led to divorce negotiations with her husband. Now she's asking for compensation, but she's already in debt. And now she can't borrow any more." My ex-husband's words stunned me. I couldn't immediately comprehend what they meant. At some point, everything became too hazy. It was like a tear in the fabric of reality, where all the hidden, dark sides of their lives began to seep through. And then, finally, I understood what had really happened. I couldn't help but recall how my sister-in-law had always hinted at something during the course of the unfolding events, their family troubles. She kept talking about long, difficult negotiations, about crazy decisions that eventually led to disasters. And now, it seemed, I saw the whole picture. Thus, my sister-in-law had become part of a much more complex story than I could have imagined. Their family relationships, consumed by greed, personal dramas, and strange financial decisions, had led them down a path with no winners. My ex-husband seemed unaware of how deeply his life had already been destroyed, but his words still sounded like a kind of finality, as if he were putting a period at the end of everything. It was all part of one big circus, and perhaps he still didn't realize that he was the lead actor in this show. Ignoring the ongoing chaos and panic around the apartment and the return of the compensation, I remained firm. My brother and I stood our ground, deciding that, despite everything, we wouldn't back down from our decision. This wasn't just a fight over an apartment, it was something bigger, much more important. I felt every word spoken here strengthening my resolve, and at the same time, I had the sense that this conflict was just the tip of the iceberg. When my ex-husband finally decided to leave, he threw me one last remark that echoed in my soul. "Because of you, my girlfriend even left me," he said with fury, his face red from anger and frustration. "You don't understand what I had to do, you don't get how hard it was for me. You don't see that all your actions ultimately destroyed me." His words weren't so much an accusation as a cry, a complaint full of helplessness. I stood there, unsure how to react, watching him walk away, leaving behind a trail of words and tears. He left without looking back, and I couldn't help but feel that with his departure, a new chapter was opening in all of our lives. I did only what was necessary. My heart was cold but resolute. With each passing day, I became stronger, while those around me lost touch with reality. I knew that now I had to move forward, without looking back. And if I had to continue my path alone, so be it.